Hello. Welcome everyone to our August session of Poets and the Faith. It's a joy to be gathered with you all again. Tonight we'll be hearing from Philip Harvey, a theological librarian, poet and parishioner of St. Peter's Eastern Hill, speaking to us about the three Victorian poets, Emily Bronte, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti. So as we begin, please do make sure that your phones are on silent if you have one on you, that you have a drink and everything you need, and if you need to use the bathroom at some stage this evening, there's women's toilets to the left over here and men's to the right, so you're very welcome to make use of those facilities if you need to. Otherwise, welcome. And we'll begin. No, we won't begin yet. Oh, we will. What
housekeeping matter.
Another housekeeping matter.
I'm giving the paper. Catherine and Carol are reading.
I forgot. Yeah.
And so Catherine is actually opening the evening.
Okay, so the readers for this evening will be myself. I'm Catherine Bellhouse. I'm the assistant priest of this parish. And Carol O'Connor, who runs our parish book room and led one of our wonderful earlier sessions on the poet Denise Lervatov. So we'll be reading for you this evening. Darkness was overtraced on every face, around clouded with storm and ominous gloom. In hut or hall smiled out no resting place. There was no resting place but one, the tomb. All our hearts were the mansions of distress, and no one laughed, and none seemed free from care. Our children felt their father's wretchedness. Our homes, one all, were shadowed with despair. It was not fear that made the land so sad.
The great majority of poems written by Emily Bronte are short expressions of desire, solitude, separation, isolation, hostility, distress, loss, longing, anguish, tempest, hopelessness, suffering. Readers know about these states of being from her novel. It is no secret to anyone in the world that Wuthering Heights is one of the great shockwaves of English literature, a work that was lightning and thunder upon its appearance in early Victorian England. That is how the novel was first received, and no amount of Kate Bush fantasy Gothic romance can veil from the receptive reader Emily Bronte's wild and seemingly unredeemed cast of characters, their own isolation, cruelty, and self-absorption, their longings, desires, and sometimes brutal honesty. A lifelong fan of the novel was the Victorian poet Algernon Swinburne, who called Wuthering Heights, quote, essentially and definitely a poem in the fullest and most positive sense of the term, which I take to mean the severity of her story is turned into redemptive vision. I use that expression very carefully. Redemptive vision by the power of her own language. She's in there, right? She's saying it, she's bringing it out. It is a vision unto itself, whatever we make of it. So this is Emily. Charlotte Bronte once described her sister as a solitude-loving raven, no gentle dove. I'll repeat that. A solitude-loving raven, no gentle dove. Yet we know this is not the end of the story because we have poems like To Imagination.
When weary with the long day's care and earthly change from pain to pain, and lost and ready to despair, thy kind voice calls me back again. O my true friend, I am not lone, whilst thou can speak with such a tone. So hopeless is the world without, the world within I doubly prize. Thy world, where guile and hate and doubt and cold suspicion never rise, where thou and I and liberty have undisputed sovereignty. What matters it that all around danger and guilt and darkness lie, if but within our bosoms bound we hold a bright, untroubled sky, warm with 10,000 mingled rays of suns that know no winter days? Reason indeed may oft complain for nature's sad reality, and tell the suffering heart how vain its cherished dreams must always be. And truth may rudely trample down the flowers of fancy, newly blown. But thou art ever there to bring the hovering vision back, and breathe new glories o'er the blighted spring, and call a lovelier life from death, and whisper with a voice divine of real worlds as bright as thine. I trust not to thy phantom bliss, yet still in evening's quiet hour, with never failing thankfulness, I welcome thee, benignant power, surer solacer of human cares, and sweeter hope when hope despairs.
Thank you, Catherine. This poem, with its exemplary calmness of voice and rhyme pattern, repeatedly finding resolution inside each verse, speaks up against the near despair we find elsewhere in her writing. The words declare the saving value of the imagination. Imagination images the world anew, serving creativity. Imagination has the power to shape and unify thought. This poem is Coleridge's influential theory, writ intimately. One we have heard about already, the theory that is, from Rowan Williams in his presentation here on R.S. Thomas. You might remember he talked about Coleridge, this theory. It's the same thing that Bronte is writing about. Imagination is superior to fancy, those products that can all too readily be overridden by truth. That is, the truth is, no. Still, for Emily, although imagination itself may prove vain at times, and she cannot trust its phantom bliss, yet she gives thanks for imagination, calls it a benignant power, and solacer, gives solace, a source of hope. An elementary fact about the Bronte sisters is that they grew up, indeed lived the greater length of their lives, in a parsonage. The Yorkshire moors bring out internal turmoil in Emily that may also be heard as her sacred place of release and freedom. At times, the landscape is even where she finds intimations of paradise. There's these things going on at the same time, where she is. The sisters lost their mother at an early age, then to be raised by her sister and their father, the Reverend Patrick Bronte, an Anglican clergyman of Calvinist persuasion, influenced by the Methodist movement, which is still a pretty new thing at that time. While this sounds austere and strict, the biographies balance this upbringing with two pluses that inform their writing, those the sisters, at every turn: a strong sense of moral responsibility and an unbounded encouragement of the creative mind. free inquiry was encouraged. This emphasis on personal and social improvement, it can confidently be understood, came from their home life in Haworth in Yorkshire.
No coward soul is mine, no trembler in the world's storm-troubled sphere. I see heaven's glories shine, and faith shines equal, arming me from fear. O God within my breast, almighty, ever-present deity, life that in me has rest, as I, undying life, have power in thee. Vain are the thousand creeds that move men's hearts, unutterably vain, worthless as withered weeds, or idlest froth amid the boundless main. To waken doubt in one holding so fast by thine infinity, so surely anchored on the steadfast rock of immortality. With wide embracing love, thy spirit animates eternal years, pervades and broods above, changes, sustains, dissolves, creates, and rears. Though earth and moon were gone, and suns and universes ceased to be, and thou were left alone, every existence would exist in thee. There is not room for death, nor atom that his might could render void. Thou art being and breath, and what thou art may never be destroyed.
Readers over 2 centuries have arrived at various conclusions about Emily Bronte. She is a pantheist, a stoic, a skeptic, a romantic, a post-romantic, an enthusiast. Like Shakespeare, she is the object of any number of projections, often based on the reader's own wishes or prejudices. Let me join this throng of projections with my own. No coward soul is mine is the most distinctive breakthrough in her thinking, written in extremis as she faces death at the age of 30. It is this culmination, for this reason, of her poetic journey. One critic says the words show in themselves her dominating character, the intrepidity of her thought, indeed, and the wing force of her poetry. What has been called Emily's singular self-possession must be placed beside her disdainful dismissal of the 1,000 creeds that move men's hearts, unutterably vain. Clues to this, clues to this seeming contradiction are found in this biographical story. And I invite you to consider this story. Listen to it carefully. This is from Patrick Bronte's, one of the biographies of Patrick Bronte. Outside the family circle, Emily was only once heard to comment on the subject of religion, and her remark was as laconic as it was typical. A friend, Mary Taylor, has related how she once told Charlotte, quote, that someone had asked me what religion I was of, with a view of getting me for a partisan, and that I had said that that was between God and me. Emily, who was lying on the hearthrug, exclaimed, "That's right." That was all I ever heard Emily say on religious subjects. Religion here means all the various versions of Christian church and practice available in the British Isles at the time, and all other beliefs, secular and otherwise. And we can conclude that Emily won't have anything to do with any of it at first. This story needs to be read in the light of other reports that when Emily was present in the Bronte box pew in church, she would sit with her back to the pulpit, bolt upright, as motionless as a statue. It needs to be remembered that her father was the preacher. But even more interesting is the general perception then and since that Emily was the child most like Patrick Bronte. They had, this is the biographers generally agree on this, they had more in common than the others. In other words, Emily is not dismissing the Thousand Creeds as such. She is rejecting anything in religion, anything at all that comes between us and God. And I will suggest that the phrase unutterably vain, a recurring line, a vain appears all the time, recurring line of thought in Emily's writing derives directly from the book of Ecclesiastes, where all is vanity, saith the preacher. I see heaven's glories shine and faith shines equal, arming me from fear, she writes late in her short life. Restlessly and firmly, Bronte words her experience, prioritising imagination, nature, and God. Another poet named Emily from this time lived across the ocean in Amherst, Massachusetts. She spent even more time cooped up at home than Emily Bronte, whether by choice or chance. I mention Emily Dickinson because she directed that the poem we have just heard be read at her funeral. Also, as it happens, later in her life, Dickinson had a portrait of Elizabeth Barrett Browning hanging on her bedroom wall. In 2009, in Great Britain, Carol Ann Duffy was named the first woman poet laureate. 159 years before, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was nominated the first woman laureate. But the job was given to Alfred Tennyson, step right up, the favourite of Queen Victoria. At the age of 4, Elizabeth Barrett is making up fully formed verse. By 11, she is writing an Homeric hymn with the relevant title for the present moment, The Battle of Marathon. Out of interest, she's doing this. And at 14, her father publishes this work, The Battle of Marathon, privately, her first book of poetry. The girl who will eventually turn into Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a prodigy. Some readers say precocious, but even prodigy is not a useful word when, after all, she just does this stuff because she likes to and because she can. She was a tomboy. She climbed trees, she went fishing. She had too many ideas, she said them. This picture of Elizabeth goes some way to dispelling the legend that follows her of being a reclusive invalid. There is no question that she suffered from ill health, often chronic, and disability for most of her life. Whether she fell from a pony or some such accident seems likely. However, medical opinion to this day, and there is a raft of literature on possible diagnoses, cannot agree on her condition. It's all out there if you want to Google. There's so many theories about what it is, but this is the way academics spend their time. So, sorry, that was a throwaway line, unnecessary. Unlike Emily Dickinson, though, who stayed in her room by choice, Elizabeth stayed in her room because she had to. Disability. In Elizabeth's case, far from being a sign of weakness, becomes her reality, the limitation that calls on faith for purpose and enables her against the odds to write profusely and to effect.
Sonnets from the Portuguese, number 6. Go from me. Yet I feel that I shall stand henceforward in thy shadow, nevermore alone upon the threshold of my door of individual life. I shall command the uses of my soul, nor lift my hand serenely in the sunshine as before, without the sense of that which I forbore, thy touch upon the palm. The widest land doom takes to part us, leaves thy heart in mine with pulses that beat double. What I do and what I dream include thee, as the wine must taste of its own grapes. And when I sue God for myself, he hears that name of thine, and sees within my eyes the tears of two.
Sonnet 14. If thou must love me, let it be for naught, except for love's sake only. Do not say, I love her for her smile, her look, her way of speaking gently, for a trick of thought that falls in well with mine, and certes brought a sense of pleasant ease on such a day. For these things in themselves, beloved, may be changed or change for thee, and love so wrought may be unwrought so. Neither love me for thine own dear pities wiping my cheeks dry, since one might well forget to weep who bore thy comfort long, and lose thy love thereby. But love me for love's sake, that evermore thou mayest love on through love's eternity.
Number 22. When our two souls stand up erect and strong, face to face, silent, drawing nigh and nigher, until the lengthening wings break into fire at either curved point, what bitter wrong can the earth do us, that we should not long here contented? Think. In mounting higher, the angels would press on us and aspire to drop some golden orb of perfect song into our deep, dear silence. Let us stay rather on earth, beloved, where the unfit, contrarious moods of men recoil away and isolate pure spirits, and permit a place to stand and love in for a day, with darkness and the death hour rounding it.
Thank you. The central fact in the Browning story is that she was courted by the young poet Robert, but her father would not allow her to marry anyone at all. The same going for all of his family. So, being a woman with a mind of her own, she and Robert eloped. Italy was interesting, and in an unexpected turn of events, they lived there, happily ever after. This romantic image was reinforced in their lifetimes by a set of 43 poems, which is also at the same time one long poem, entitled Sonnets from the Portuguese. It's the biggest seller in the Victorian era. Everyone read it. We know that these private poems were never intended for publication, that she only plucked up the courage to show them to Robert after they'd been living in Florence for some time, and that it was Robert who encouraged their publication. Robert's supposed to have said, this is the best sonnet sequence in Shakespeare, you can't have it sitting in a drawer. That's what he's saying to her. The sonnets detail Elizabeth's doubts, sense of unworthiness, emerging hopes, stunned amazement, and other emotions experienced when falling in love with someone and then staying in love with them. The poems dwell on the mystery of what is happening. They speak to what is unknown. And in this way are emblems of faith, sometimes faith alone.
Let the world's sharpness, like a clasping knife, shut in upon itself, and do no harm in this close hand of love, now soft and warm. And let us hear no sound of human strife after the click of the shutting. Life to life, I lean upon thee, dear, without alarm, and feel as safe as guarded by a charm, against the stab of worldlings who, if rife, are weak to injure. Very whitely still, the lilies of our lives may reassure their blossoms from their roots, accessible to heavenly dews that drop not fewer, growing straight out of man's reach on the hill. God only, who made us rich, can make us poor.
Number 26. I lived with visions for my company instead of men and women years ago, and found them gentle mates, nor thought to know a sweeter music than they played to me. But soon their trailing purple was not free of this world's dust. Their lutes did silent grow, and I myself grew faint and blind below their vanishing eyes. Then thou didst come, to be, beloved, what they seemed. Their shining fronts, their songs, their splendours, better yet the same as river water hallowed into fonts, met in thee. And from out thee overcame my soul with satisfaction of all wants, because God's gifts put man's best dreams to shame.
Sonnet 42. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs, and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death.
We are used to hearing her most famous line, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," in splendid isolation. But the line arrives at the very end of the whole sequence, in the penultimate sonnet. We can see how Victorian readers would have been surprised and amazed by this culminating moment to everything that has gone before. The poet is claiming her belief in love, but in love not simply as a declaration, but as an affirmation that rises above loss and volume and, thank you. Is
that better?
I hope so. Is that okay? I'll start that again. poet is claiming her belief in love, but in love not simply as a declaration, but as an affirmation that rises above loss, change, and all the vicissitudes of time, even death. Also, very quietly but emphatically, the poet recurrently speaks of God. Elizabeth did many things we think of as modern. For example, she kept her family name as well as her married name without aid of a hyphen. The sonnets are not from the Portuguese language. The Portuguese was one of Robert's terms of affection for Elizabeth due to her olive complexion, making the title of the series an endearment and a witticism. At the age of 20, she had published a work entitled An Essay on Mind, which is mentioned in our context because it signifies something of Elizabeth's attitude to religion, which is that religion, and therefore faith, are all an essential part of the life of the mind. I find that this way of seeing Elizabeth helps us explain and at least appreciate her lifetime of roving interest in the spiritual life. Growing up, her family attended Anglican worship every Sunday morning. This was augmented, we could say, by attendance the same evening at the local congregational church, a practice more common in the 19th century than any time since. She took a passing interest in dispensationalist church thought and other manifestations of nonconformism. Later in Italy, she became involved in spiritualism, even as she spent each day in Florence listening to the singing from the Roman Catholic Church directly across the lane from her home at Casa Guidi, near the Pitti Palace. Some may say this sounds like shopping around. I think it reveals the expansiveness of her own searching for meaning. The spiritual life informs her life's work. One of her essays stating, "Poetry is where God is." When she asserts, "If you desire faith, then you have faith enough." One to think about. Barrett Browning is opening a common existential reality. It is apparent that her congregationalism informs her social activism, whether in England, where she gradually becomes an abolitionist of slavery, the slavery, by the way, in Jamaica that benefited the Barrett family, or in Italy, helping lead the charge for national unification. She was also a feminist before feminism. The foundation of St. Peter's Eastern Hill, as the screen here testifies, was 1846. So Joseph Latrobe laid the foundation, whatever the foundation is, in that year. Though my history tells me St. Peter's became the parish church of the City of Melbourne in 1847 because, amongst other things, that's when Melbourne becomes a city. 1847 is the date, 1846, 47 is what I'm focusing on. 1847 is called the Annus Mirabilis of the Bronte sisters, the year that saw the publication of, the publication of Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights, 1847. And 1847 is the year Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning arrived to live in Italy for the rest of their life together. It is in 1847 when Christina Rossetti, aged 17, has a set of poems published by her family and begins writing in all sorts of poetic forms, this time in earnest. Indeed, there is a curious symmetry here as well. Today, Elizabeth is politically more famous in Italy than England because of her public expressions of actions in support of the Risorgimento, the movement for a united and republican, even Italy. It is this same anti-monarchical, at times, we're talking about Italy, an independent cause that led the Rossetti family to leave Naples for London 30 years earlier. Put simply, the Rossettis found themselves on the wrong side. The Rossettis escaped the very political upheaval that Elizabeth walked into simply by landing up in the middle of Tuscany in 1847. The Carbonari Rossettis went into self-imposed exile in England because of politics. Later, the Brownings went into self-imposed exile in Italy because of marriage.
What Are Heavy by Christina Rossetti. What are heavy? Sea sand and sorrow. What are brief? Today and tomorrow. What are frail? Spring blossoms and youth. What are deep? The ocean and truth.
In adulthood, Christina Rossetti once expressed a desire to write a biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This came to nothing. She was much too busy on other things, but it tells us how influential Elizabeth was on Christina, Emily Dickinson, and other younger readers and writers of the time. Christina's astounding Mona Inominata is a rejoinder to Elizabeth's sonnets from the Portuguese, something she states explicitly in the introduction to that sonnet series. And I'm going to read out a few lines from Sonnet 10. It's not on your sheet, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that. But this is from Mona Innominata in response to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Time flies, hope flags, life plies a wearied wing, death following hard on life gains ground apace, faith runs with each and rears an eager face, outruns the rest, makes light of everything, spurns earth and still finds breath to pray and sing, while love ahead of all uplifts his praise, still asks for grace and still gives thanks for grace, content with all day brings and night will bring. Like the two poets we have been listening to, Christina was very well read in scripture and theology. But with her, the discovery of worship and devotion turns into a lifetime of creativity, and vice versa. The discovery of creativity turns into a lifetime of devotion. A hard-won line goes, obedience is the fruit of faith, patience is the early blossom on the tree of faith. This patience exists as a grounding, a groundswell, a presence throughout her writing. Faith, both in the sense of the virtue and of the Christian religion itself, preoccupies Rossetti throughout her writing life and could be called its driving force, even where the word faith is not overtly used. She speaks from inside her own chosen religious life, and that is how we have to read her.
Love is alone the worthy law of love. Love is alone the worthy law of love. All other laws have presupposed a taint. Love is the law from kindled saint to saint, from lamb to lamb, from dove to answering dove. Love is the motive of all things that move harmonious by free will without constraint. Love learns and teaches. Love shall man acquaint with all he lacks, which all his lack is love. Because love is the fountain, I discern the stream as love. For what but love should flow from fountain love? Not bitter from the sweet. I, ignorant, have I laid claim to know? Oh, teach me. Love such knowledge as is meet for one to know who is fain to love and learn.
To understand Christina, we must meet the family. Central is their mother, Frances Polidori Rossetti, a woman of strong character who was the mainstay of the family. Their father, Gabriele, brought with him to England a head full of Italian knowledge, most especially of the second greatest European poet, Dante Alighieri, all of which he taught in London, causing significant cultural influence that was only eclipsed later by Prince Albert's German crazes, Christmas trees and stuff like that. The parents are regularly described in the literature as devout Anglo-Catholics, though whether they actually recognise that term themselves is an open question. What's important is that when Christina is a teenager in the 1840s, they are attending Christchurch, Albany Street, London, Church of William Dodsworth, an important leader in the emerging Oxford movement. This makes them at once both radical and conservative in that society, depending on your point of view. The children were characterised by their father as being, and I quote, two storms, Christina and Dante Gabriel, and two calms, Maria and William. Sound like families you know? The two storms and the two calms. This leads us to Maria Rossetti, the eldest sister, who chucks worldly life in favour of the religious life. She eventually joins All Saints Sisters of the Poor at Margaret Street in Westminster, one of the first Anglican orders for women. The sisters are employed in nursing the poor and destitute in the parish. Millicent Hopkins was another member of the order, sister of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Maria herself wrote copiously, including a translation of the monastic diurnal into English and versions and commentaries on He's Omnipresent, Dante. Maria's life, example, and influence on Christina are impossible to measure, who herself wrote her own devotional calendars for the public and dedicated her remarkable long poem, Goblin Market, to Maria. Like the Brontes, we are looking at a family whose creative lives involve an extraordinary exchange of imaginative thought over time. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, DG, as he is fondly known by his many fans, was himself not personally someone of committed faith, but he understands Christina's commanding and original gifts and is actively engaged in supporting her writing. We don't have YouTube clips of their editorial conversations, but are aware through their work of the remarkable reciprocity and mutuality in their respective enterprises. DG's ultimate descent into squalor and drug addiction stands in marked contrast to Christina's reserve, sobriety, and humility. And then there is William Michael. He is a shining light in the family's affairs, keeping everything going through bankruptcies, ill health, all manner of crazy sibling behaviour, especially from the very wayward DG. He wrote his own history of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, of which they were all a part, as many of you will know, as we all know. and edited Christina's new verse after her death, writing in the, this is William Michaels writing this, after her death, writing in the introduction of Christina thus. Christina's habits of composing were eminently of the spontaneous kind. I question her having ever once deliberated with herself whether or not she should write out something or other, and then, after thinking out a subject, having proceeded to treat it in regular spells of work. Instead of this, something impelled her feelings, or came into her head, and her hand obeyed the dictation. I cannot ever remember seeing her in the act of composition. She consulted nobody and solicited no advice, though it is true that with regard to her published volumes, or at any rate the first two of them, my brother volunteered to point out what seemed well adapted for insertion and what the reverse, and he found her a very willing recipient of his monitions. End of sentence. William attempts here in an empirical way to describe processes we can identify as like prayer. Indeed, often in reading her poetry, we find ourselves close to liturgy, to the liturgical life that was her regular weekly experience.
Twice. I took my heart in my hand, oh my love, oh my love. I said, let me fall or stand, let me live or die, but this once hear me speak, oh my love, oh my love. Yet a woman's words are weak, you should speak, not I. You took my heart in your hand with a friendly smile. With a critical eye you scanned, then set it down and said, it is still unripe. Better wait a while. Wait while the skylarks pipe till the corn grows brown. And you set it down, it broke, but I did not wince. I smiled at the speech you spoke, at your judgment that I heard. But I have not often smiled since then, nor questioned since, nor cared for cornflowers wild, nor sung with the singing bird. I take my heart in my hand, oh my God, my broken heart in my hand. Thou hast seen, judge thou. My hope was written on sand, oh my God, oh my God. Now let thy judgment stand, yea, judge me now. This condemned of a man, this marred one heedless day, this heart take thou to scan, both within and without. Refine with fire its gold, purge thou its dross away, yea, hold it in thy hold, whence none can pluck it out. I take my heart in my hand, I shall not die but live. Before thy face I stand, I, for thou call'st such. All that I have I bring, all that I am I give. Smile thou, and I shall sing, but shall not question much.
Thank you, Cara. It is a commanding and confident voice that may plead, a woman's words are weak, then proceed to lay out the terms of relationships that are, it turns out, actually the very terms of existence. Her ability to pull the carpet out from under the reader, to leave the reader in two minds about what she is saying, to make a conversation of direct personal concern feel like a conversation the reader overhears by chance, to state straight the most pressing issue on her mind, and yours, are amongst the reasons why she enjoys such a renaissance today. She has that rarest of gifts, the gift of expressing deep feeling in quiet speech and perfect musical cadence. Two other distinctive features of Christina's writing are evident in this poem. The first is, and we've heard it before from William Michael and D.G., spontaneity. D.G. himself was a well-known poet of the era, still is, regarded his sister as the more spontaneous of the two poets, a word already used by William to describe her in general. It was said that Christina's genius roved where it listed and was incapable of education. Also that her voice, clear, vibrant and bell-like, was one of her greatest charms. We often sense these things when hearing her poetry, and it goes in hand with her remarkable skill at line variation. We see it in twice. Short and long lines interweave. There are well-timed starts and stops in the phrasing. The shift from address about a person to address about God, made with the utmost calm. It's hard to believe that some critics at the time complained about all these varying lengths of line, wanting something more rhythmic and Tennysonian. But the reader or listener notices these changes in tone, statement, pausing, as the trust in her own spontaneity and direction. The sheer variety of spoken word that Christina could employ ranges from the nursery rhyme to the most majestic, almost Byzantine-like hymn. From back and forth of an epic litany, her litanies are amazing, they're just extraordinary. Epic litany to the formal reading of a lesson from the Gospel, as here.
Then they that feared the Lord spake often one to another. Friend, I commend thee to the narrow way, not because I, please God, will walk therein, but rather for the love feast of that day, the exceeding prize which whoso will may win. This world is old and rotting at the core. Here death's heads mock us with a toothless grin. Here heftiest laughter leaves us spent and sore. We heap up treasures for the fretting moth. Our children heap, our fathers heaped before. But what shall profit us the cumbrous growth? It cannot journey with us, cannot save, stripped in that darkness, be we lief or loath. Stripped bare to what we are all from all we have. Naked we came, naked we must return to one obscure, inevitable grave. If this the lesson is which we must learn, taught by God's discipline of love or wrath, to brand or purify, his fire must burn. Friend, I commend to thee the narrow way, that thou and I, please God, may walk therein, may taste and see how good is God, who hath loved us, while hating even to death our sin.
Well, thank you, Philip, for what was an incredibly pithy and wonderfully vivid introduction, a series of vignettes to the lives and to the families of these three poets, and some beautiful observations and insights into their character and their work. We have about 15 minutes now for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question of Philip, we have a roving mic, so please do raise your hand. Begin.
We had these poems read so beautifully by these two ladies, and I just wondered, the poets who wrote these poems, on what occasions would they have had their poems read publicly, or were they just in written form?
Question was about whether in the poets' lives there would have been a lot of occasions on which they'd had their works read publicly, or whether they were mainly circulated in written form.
Well, they're written to be recited, these poems, and memorised. But remember too, though, that these poets are prolific. So they're really producing an enormous amount of poetry, and of course they're already living in a world in the 19th century of publication. So there's this incredible pressure to be producing, once you've established of continuing to produce a lot of material, you see. So it's a question of, clearly they're in the space at the time when they're writing the poetry, and they do, and I imagine that some of these poets would be wanting them to be read publicly or whatever. But it raises this whole question too of how we read poetry. We're very privileged here tonight to be able to have some people actually reciting poetry to us. This is not always such a common thing in our society for this to be happening on a regular basis. But there's also this other process of reading the poem. Some people say that you shouldn't have poetry readings at all. There are actually people that say this is a terrible thing, but the poetry is there. It's between you and the poet.
Like Emily and God.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's this kind of thing, you know. Whereas I prefer the more reading, the better, really. That's right. But they're certainly writing the poems as memorable language. So for recitation, you would carry around some of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's verse in your head for appropriate and inappropriate occasions.
Can I ask a rather open question that you can answer any way you'd like, really? But what are some of the ways in which Elizabeth Barrett Browning might have influenced Christina Rossetti's work? In terms of ideas or style?
Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as I've said, has a huge impact. She's a major writer in England and in the United States right through that whole time, including on Rossetti. So because she's such an inspiration, and she's writing a poem, she's a classicist. She knew Greek, Latin, she could read the Bible in Hebrew, right? So this is a person like this guy. And she's, what am I saying? Sorry, I've lost the track of, she's a...
Influence on Christina.
Well, yeah, she's having a big impact on a lot of writers. Christina, some critics say, oh no, she's doing Barrett Browning again, you know, like it's too much like, because they're all used to reading. But of course what Christina is doing is something, it's her own voice, it's this kind of very personal spoken thing that she's doing. Like Barrett Browning's much more controlled, there'd be lots of drafts. Lots of versions of the things that she's writing. So she's getting all of the phrasing absolutely right, whereas that's not what Rossetti does at all. But very, very important influence. Yeah.
You both have questions?
Yes,
or?
I think so.
Oh, okay, one after
I've
the
just
other.
got a quick question.
Yeah.
It's and not an important question, but it will satisfy my curiosity. You said, and it leads on from your question, Christine used Elizabeth Barrett Browning as a role model when she was 17. In today's society, a 17 would use somebody like Taylor Swift as a role model for writing and getting her ideas on life. But that hero worship these days is very fleeting. When Christine worshipped Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was it longer? Was it, and in general, were those sort of associations back in those days longer for life, or were they, okay,
I
you're a
would
pop
suggest
star
that Christina Rossetti didn't worship anybody.
Okay.
I'm picking you up on the use of the word worship there, because idol worship, there are lots of writers and individuals she totally adored, and she's writing poems about them. But she's a Christian, and she's very serious. So worship that's a different matter.
Well, okay, leaving the word worship out of it.
Sorry.
Using her as a role model, as somebody she looked up to in whatever terminology.
It's not out of place to mention Taylor Swift here, because
was it a lifelong interest, or was it just a fleeting? I'm 17. By the time I get to 20, I've moved on to somebody else. As a 17-year-old these days would more likely do.
One of the things I'm showing in the paper is that these people are very creative. They are living in a highly creative environment, family environment, but also social environment that is constantly being reinforced, right? So she's going to be interested, I would suggest, in Elizabeth Barrett Browning because of the amazing things you can do with words and poetry. It's not, oh wow, this poem is so fantastic. Of course it's fantastic, but she's interested in how did she do that? Mm. And why is she writing like that? Why is she writing a poem like that?
And was she interested in those things from the time she was 17 until the time she was 40, or from the time she was 17 until the time she was 20? I think my question is more about the longevity of her interest. These days, a 17-year-old would be interested in somebody for a very fleeting time.
Oh, I see, yeah. No, I couldn't really respond to that question. She was continuing to read very widely, And there's also this whole thing of the Italian literature. So a lot of her writing, she is bringing into English Dante, Petrarch, Metastasio, and other of the great Italian writers, and doing it in English, right? That's one of the things that's happening in the language, in the way that she. It sounds simple. It's not simple.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Philip. My name's Georgia. My question is about Emily Bronte. I picture her living in this little country parsonage. She seems to get a lot of succour from her internal life, her imagination and her faith. Yeah. But it's like all around her, everything is darkness and really horrible. And what is it that she's seeing externally that she's writing about? Was she engaged in work with the parish, or what is it that she's seeing?
Oh, thanks. I can't speak for her. I can't speak for Emily Bronte. All we can do is try to put together, and there's an enormous literature. It's just the Bronte literature, as we know, is just huge. So it's trying to piece together, but I couldn't say myself. I don't know. Sorry if that's probably not the answer you want. they lived very close life. The Bronte sisters, I don't know, there are probably Bronte readers and scholars here who would know much more about this than I do. I find it quite fascinating that all of the sisters created these stories. Gondal, you're aware of all of that? Like, when they were young, they're writing all of these fairy tales and fantasies, some of which have disturbing kind of mirror images of the British Empire, I have to say. Odd things seem to be happening in places that sound like Australia, for example. But out of that, they never recover. They never recover, but what happens is they learn how to tell a story. And so there's this incredible transformation that happens in their early 20s or late, whatever, where they go from simply making up these wonderful stories, because they're all escapist stories, and some of them are happening in Yorkshire, but mostly elsewhere, Gondal and other kinds of fantasy lands, really. But then they suddenly they're transforming the things that they're encountering in the town, but everywhere in Yorkshire and around, into these extraordinary novels. They're like, where does that come from?
Thanks. I think we have another question.
And it's the fact that they're all together that makes that happen as well. They're not isolated, They've got each other. Yeah.
If I heard you correctly, there was a point there where Rossetti was neck and neck with Tennyson for Poet Laureate. Did I get that right?
No, Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
Sorry, Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
No, the Rossetti... go on, yeah.
Sorry, I'm on my second glass of wine.
Enjoy.
Could you...
That's an order.
Could you tell us what your perception is regarding one versus the other, and in terms of what you think as to which was more worthy over the other?
Which was more...
More worthy.
Wordy.
Worthy.
Worthy.
Would it have been nicer if the lady had actually won the award, and was she good enough or wasn't she? What's your thoughts? Who's Tennyson versus her?
Well, I don't know. There are some poet laureates that are somewhat forgettable. So it's a tricky thing with laureates, and I personally am not into grading. I think that writers, poets who are creating work like this, how can I put this? They are wanting to talk to you, someone, in some way, right? They're not interested in the competition. Readers play the game of the competition. Critics play the game of competition. That's what goes on. That's why we read book reviews and, this book's great and that one's terrible. So the three poets that we're listening to tonight are totally amazing.
Sorry, that's fine and dandy.
No, it's not.
But at the end of the day, somebody had to decide who was more worthy than the other, and that's how it works.
I don't know.
And I'm just asking you, could you comment in relation to Tennyson versus the other in
Tennyson.
some way?
Oh, I see, yeah. I don't know, you'll have to ask someone at the Palace.
Thank you.
Would be my feeling about
we
that
have
one.
a question here.
And taste, it's the tastes of the time.
I'm just interested, really, in Emily Bronte, the great love story of Heathcliff and Cathy.
Yes.
It's infamous, and the way Cathy says, "I am Heathcliff," it was just so overpowering. And I think, for these spinsters to be all having this great imagination about this great love story of Heathcliff and Cathy, I think it's really extraordinary that she had this imagination.
Oh, well.
Anyway, getting back to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, of course, she was a very Christian woman, and this epistle to the Ephesians also talks about the breadth, length, height and depth. And I think that's where she got it from St. Paul. Yeah. And also I believe that she had a great devotion to Our Lady as well. I seem to remember reading that somewhere.
all three of these poets assume that you know the Bible.
Yes, yes.
They're not worried about footnotes.
But I think it's a direct copy of St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians.
Oh, she would be using that for a very specific reason in the poem, yeah. That's right. Yes, yeah. Jim. Oh, yes.
There are little clusters of streets named after here and there in Melbourne, there are little clusters of streets named after literary figures of that time. They're mostly male figures, but does that reflect a greater and wider appreciation in society of these poets and writers at that period than exists today? Exists for writers of today?
Yeah, I know. Milton's all over the place, isn't he? Milton. And down in St Kilda, you've got Poets' Corner. You know Poets' Corner? Yeah. I think the settlers were, taking the best of British and putting it on the landscape.
So you have to be British to be there?
That's what's going on. That's right. You're going to hear some more in my summary about that, by the way. I have a summary coming along. I don't know how much time we've got left.
We do have a few more minutes for questions. If anyone...
I hope I'm helping. I'm just...
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My question is, it was only until the 19th century suddenly that we have women poets. I mean, there were writers before that, but we don't know them. What would you attribute that to? Why did suddenly the women's voices start to be heard?
That is a very big question. That's a very amazing question. And in my reading, because I do this for enjoyment, I thought, I'm going to have study. And you kind of go, the more you read, the more you find these women are all talking to one another, they're all communicating, they're all interested in, and it's all happening, it's not happening in the 1970s, it's happening in the 1850s, and they're all getting, a lot of these, they're all getting their poetry published. The Brontes still had to publish, what are they? Acton, Currer, and Emily was Ellis. So they took their poetry, but they had to males nom de plume, this kind of thing. But that's a very big question. I haven't got the answer, except education would have something to do with it.
I think Carol has...
Oh, Carol knows more.
Oh, what I wanted to say, Philip, is when you were working on this paper, you observed to me a couple of times how the women, unlike the men, this is my interpretation of what you were saying, they could just speak their own voice because they didn't have that, they didn't have to live up to any expectations of stanzas even though they did, there's something much more direct. They were able to speak unmediated from themselves than many of the men poets of this time. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Carol. Yeah, I would describe them, all three poets we've heard tonight, as straight shooters, Stuart. Straight shooters, all three. These are people who are not... Sorry? I've lost my track of thought now. Sorry.
That was good about them being straight.
Yeah, that's the basic message. I think it's very true. The women, they've got a lot of space, but they are educated.
Yeah. As a follow-up, what effect do you think Elizabeth Barrett Browning had on Robert Browning? Did she influence him in any way?
Seismic. And I think that much has been written, of course, about that relationship. But clearly, what's more interesting is not their relationship is absolutely fascinating because it's a creative relationship of equals. That's what that is an amazing thing to happen. anyway, at any time. But when you have that thing of two incredibly creative, and they are both affirming each other all the time, right? What's more amusing, depending on your point of view, is the reception of the Brownings by the literary people of England, especially the gentlemen. Because increasingly the gentlemen say, oh, well, you know, Robert was, you know, he's pretty damn good, really. Well, Elizabeth, you know, she's, well, you know. And you sort of go, this is just hopeless. This is not the way you read poetry, and it's not the way that you appreciate the fact that these two people are really kind of they're speaking to you in this incredibly powerful way. You know, raised language, you know.
Thank you again, Philip. I think we might conclude questions there. That was wonderful. So I'm not sure. I think we might clap now and then listen to...
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I have some concluding remarks, like a little summary of what we've heard tonight, and then I'm going to read one last poem by Christina Rossetti. And some of this will be maybe clarify some things in the questions too. To contemplate the sprawling metropolis of Melbourne in 2024, it is apparent fairly quickly that certain kinds of faith have got us where we are. Sad is Eros, builder of cities, says W.H. Auden, because we know that the settler societies were animated by forms of faith at odds with the message of the gospel. The 19th century is the full-blown expression of the Industrial Revolution, of which we, at the other end of that revolution, are the unhappy and ambivalent inheritors in such forms as climate change, unquestioned consumerism, and forewarnings of extinction. This revolution came about through a faith in progress, which was served through exploitation of humans and the environment, came to be the justification for imperial projects, leading often to political conflict and, in fact, world wars. Both Christina and Elizabeth especially were vocal critics of this kind of faith and where it would lead. They were able to do this because of their grounding in Christianity. The fabled crisis of religious faith in 19th century English life, a popular theme in poetry classes of the last century, has always to be placed beside the extraordinary manifestations of actual faith in the same period, whether in the reaffirmations of church and society or at the most personal level of individual life and experience. The three eminent Victorian poets, I use that expression quite deliberately, eminent Victorian poets we listened to this evening, speak from examination and experience about the life of faith. Firmly aware of the abiding nature of the faith, capital F. Each of them belonged in highly creative family environments. Each was given freedom to pursue their creative, poetic lives. Each had access to books, to large home libraries that they were free to explore as they wished, read everything. Each had permanent access to Scripture. Each encountered at an early age the reality of the Anglican Church. Well, as we've heard, all the churches, but the Anglican Church, that's their church, its teachings and practices, how they learnt from that church tradition, or rather traditions, and responded to them is an animating truth of their writing and witness. Important to say in this context is that none of them are the same. They develop their own special ways of speaking into the whole central matter of faith. Anglican tradition, we observe, is not about sameness, but distinctiveness, their distinctive thoughts and voices. And this is a sonnet from later life. So it's at the end of her life, Christina Rossetti reflecting, and she wrote this wonderful double sonnet of sonnets, in other words, 28 of them, reflecting on different things in her life. And this is number 10. Tread softly, all the earth is holy ground. It may be, could we look with seeing eyes, this spot we stand on is a paradise, where dead have come to life and lost been found, where faith has triumphed, martyrdom been crowned, where fools have foiled the wisdom of the wise. From this same spot the dust of saints may rise, and the king's prisoners come to light unbound. O earth, 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 thou thy Maker's word hear. Thy dead thou shalt give up, nor hide thy slain. Some who went weeping forth shall come again, rejoicing from the east or from the west. As doves fly to their windows, love's own bird, contented and desirous, to the nest. Thank you.
And thank you all so much for coming. Please do leave your glasses on the table at the front or at the back to help us with cleaning up. And please do take a leaflet on your way out. If you don't already have the dates of our subsequent poetry events, we'd love to see you here again.